C's online classes, lesson number 2 of Unit 2, which is marketing. We are currently in the product of the 4 P's, and we are going to look at the product life cycle. So, a product life cycle describes the life cycle of a product. Who would have seen that coming? And it's a lot of important info to learn about, and marketers and businesses use product life cycles to figure out when they can expect to cash in, what kind of returns they can expect on their products, what kind of experiences their competitor products will have. Lots of good reasons for it, and it's also just useful to understand how products live, quote unquote, in the business world. Let's continue with the PLC, or product life cycle. So what is a product life cycle? And I said this already. It describes the life of a product from conception to it being discontinued. So it contains the entire marketing process, and it also looks at the product's life on the shelf. Okay. Describes the stages of the new product as it goes from beginning to end. So a product goes through 5 different stages, and the PLC examines each one of them, and we're going to talk about that. So I may say phases or stages. I mean, they both mean exactly the same thing in this context. So yeah, stage, phase, it's just a piece of the product's life. So let's actually look at a PLC. So this is a general hypothetical PLC. You see 5 words here, but these are not the 5 stages. Development and introduction are actually part of phase 1. So development has to do with when the product is actually conceived. What that means is that someone has an idea, they start jotting down notes, they start talking to people, they start figuring out how this product could be produced, how it could be shipped to different stores, what kind of pricing strategy. Lots of different things happen. So most of the marketing mix is actually taken care of in the development phase. And what happens is introduction is where products actually start to hit the shelves. There's actually an icon on the website that you can use to purchase the product and stuff like that. One important note is that promotion usually starts in the development phase. You might think that it's the introduction phase, but it's not. Can you think of a reason why you'd want to promote a product before you actually have it ready to go? I'll give you a hint. Look at movies. Often when you see a trailer for a movie, that's all they've recorded. They record specific scenes that they think will work well for a trailer. And that's really about it. They're usually still shooting, and sometimes they're still even writing when they shoot a trailer. And if your guess was that they want to generate customer awareness, then you are absolutely right. Remember, one of the conditions for creating demand is awareness of the product's existence. So usually, once they figure out that they can make the product, that's when they'll start to advertise it. But introduction is where the product actually hits the shelves and it's available for purchase. But both development and introduction are phase 1. Growth is phase 2. Maturity is phase 3. Decline is phase 4. And phase 5 isn't actually on this diagram, but it exists, and it's called the decision point. And we're going to go into that later. But anyway, so phase 1, development and introduction. So, like I said, the product is researched and gradually developed. Product is finally introduced into the marketplace through a launch. So, I'm trying to think of an example that you've probably seen. Given what's happening right now, you're probably playing more video games or more apps than you normally do. So you might have seen video game launch events. So they'll do things like pre-ordering, which we'll talk about later. They'll have maybe a special giveaway or a special package that you can get where you get like an exclusive skin for your character or some special content or, access to certain things. Not all products have a formal launch. Sometimes a launch is just, now the product's on the shelf, but other times there's usually some sort of event where promotions are rolled out, where there's a memorandum, like a piece of paper that's passed through all the stores saying, hey, don't forget to promote this product and make sure your salesmen talk about it and stuff like that. It's very subjective in terms of how a product is launched, and that's for the business owners to decide. So yeah, businesses, this is where promotion starts. And remember, it usually starts in the development stage. You want to inform the customers about the product's existence, what its features are, its competitive advantages, where the product's available, et cetera, et cetera. And at this point, they're appealing primarily to people that are called early adopters. So early adopters are the folks who purchase a product right away. If you've ever gone shopping for a phone when the new iPhone comes out, you've probably seen lines of people outside the store. I don't know if they still do it now, but a couple of years ago, it was not uncommon for people to camp outside of Apple stores so they could be the first to get their hands on a phone. Isn't that crazy? Well, not crazy. If they're enthusiastic about it, then fine. But there was... You don't hear about it anymore, especially not now. But people used to camp for a lot of things. Like in the early 2000s, when the Star Wars prequels came out, thousands of people would camp in front of the theaters in Star Wars costume. And they did it because they were really excited to see the new movie. And so people who will go out of their way to buy a product right away are called early adopters. And you normally see a lot more early adopters for A, entertainment, and B, technology. So, a lot of people will buy a game right when it comes out, and they'll often pre-order. So sometimes a launch event can include a pre-order. So you can... for those of you who don't know, pre-ordering is buying a game or buying tickets to a movie or buying tickets to a sports event, like maybe the Ultimate Fighting Championship or a special kind of season for different sports, where you pay an upfront price to get the earliest possible access to the product. Often sometimes they'll charge a little bit more, but they'll give you more content in exchange for that higher price. But people will buy things before they're even finished, mainly because they trust the brand or they trust the company enough to ensure that they get early access. Now, early adopters are quite important because they influence the next stage of the PLC, which is growth. So what happens in growth is the early adopters have bought the product in the introduction stage. And depending on how things go, depending on whether they like the product or not, they will tell their friends, they'll tell their family, they'll post on social media and stuff like that. But what happens is there's an exponential, hopefully you remember that word from your math classes, but there's an exponential increase in sales where more and more people very, very quickly start buying the product. And that's where growth happens. So what'll happen is growth is marked by an acceleration or an increase in the rate that sales are increasing. So it's double increasing. It's acceleration is what's happening. And so growth is where a lot of costs are recovered and a lot of sales are made. But the hallmark of growth is that the rate at which sales increase itself is increasing. So you're accelerating, kind of like driving a car. When you push the acceleration pedal, your speed isn't the only thing that's increasing, but the rate at which your speed increases. And so, yeah, that's what happens in the growth stage. So hopefully sales increase exponentially. What happens is if the product is good, if the early adopters like the product and they're satisfied, they feel like it was a worthwhile purchase, they'll communicate positively about it. And then other people follow suit. Now, growth is also where products fail if they're not good. I keep going back to games. I don't know why. Maybe maybe I should stop following game news so much. But have you guys ever heard of Fallout 76? It's Fallout is a movie. It's a game made by a company called Bethesda, and traditionally Fallout has been a big deal game wise. You've probably heard of Fallout 4. And it's this sort of dystopian future where there's been some kind of nuclear war and you're living in the fallout. And that's why it's called Fallout. But Fallout 76 was a terrible game. I didn't purchase it because a few friends of mine told me that they were really unhappy with the game. And they were early adopters. So they pre-purchased the game because they trusted Bethesda that company would make a good product, but they didn't. They dropped the ball. And so, the early adopters in that case told everyone, don't buy this, the game sucks. And so the product died in the growth phase. But hopefully, and in the case of this hypothetical PLC, the product catches on, people are satisfied, they communicate positively, and sales grow faster and faster and faster. And so what happens in growth phase, this is sort of a minor thing, but it's worth noting. Well, actually, it's not minor. It's minor in the grand scheme of what we're talking about. But what happens is as a product gains traction, and as your product becomes more popular, competitors will take notice of you. And what will happen is they will start changing their products to try and preemptively develop a competitive advantage over you. And they will try and find ways to develop non-sustainable competitive advantages. Hopefully you remember that phrase. But they will try to come up with ways to keep their customers before they switch to you, to the new product. You're the new king on the block, and other companies don't want to lose money to you. So they will try and figure out ways to either take your customers or to keep their customers coming back. So they might have a sale, for example, to keep their customers buying their stuff instead of going to you. Lots of different things can happen. We're not going to talk about that actual part of growth so much, but it is worth knowing for sure. Okay, phase 3, maturity. The thing to remember about maturity is it's where you want to be. The longer you can be in maturity, the better. Maturity is usually marked by the fact that the acceleration of sales stops. You'll notice that this is a flat line here pretty much. So we're accelerating, and then right around here we stop accelerating. Now that doesn't mean that we're not going fast. We still have lots of sales. We have a high rate of sales, metaphorically speaking, a high rate of speed, if you know what I mean, but we're not accelerating anymore. So maturity, if you think of sales as driving a car, growth is where you're accelerating, and then maturity is where you've reached the speed limit. And you're going 100 kilometers an hour on the freeway, and you just want to stay cruising for as long as possible. Now, what happens is, I'll explain this more later, but maturity is where you cash in. So during growth, your sales numbers are going up, which means you're making more money, which means you're paying your costs back. It means that you're recovering your debt. Usually, by the time you reach maturity, you've paid off your debts, you've paid off your expenses, and this is where the profit comes in. So companies actively want to make their maturity phase as long as possible, because this is the good place. This is where you want to be. So In maturity, growth is slow, if at all. Usually there's not much growth at all. But that doesn't mean that you don't have high sales numbers. You do. You're just not accelerating as much. So the number of sales is consistently high and will reach its highest point in this phase. Companies manage the product through continued advertising, keeping the brand in the public eye. So they'll keep, at this point, they're sort of reminding you that they exist as opposed to informing you that they exist. Companies generally earn a large portion of their profits here. So this, like I said, this is where companies cash in. The longer you can stay in maturity, the better. So a lot of money has been spent researching the product, developing the product, creating it, designing it, building it, promoting it. That all costs a lot of money. And so through the growth stage, they've spent their money, or they've spent all their revenue paying back those expenses. Now that their expenses are paid off, that means that money goes into their pocket, which is what you want. Now, the maturity phase can last years, even decades, depending on the product, or sometimes it can be cut very short. Oh my God, the rectangle. Go away! Thank you! It's usually a few months long for a phone. It varies very much per product. Now, I should say that just because some maturity phases aren't long, that doesn't mean that they're not highly profitable. A great example of that is a movie. Movies are only in theaters for maybe 2 months. It really depends, but they're usually not in theaters for very long. But, like Avengers Endgame made $1 billion in like a month and a half. So, just because the maturity phase isn't long doesn't mean it's not profitable. It varies from product to product. But yeah, maturity is where it's at. That's where the boon is. That's where the gold is. That's where you want to be. Now, an example of a failed maturity stage, or one that's preemptively cut short, is vape pens. Vaping was explosively popular when it first came out because it delivers a huge hit of nicotine, an unhealthy hit of nicotine. What happened? I mean, you're breathing vaporized oil when you do this. So, obviously it's not good for you. But doctors didn't realize how bad it was because they have to do studies and they have to conduct research and all this stuff. But vape pens had a very profitable maturity stage for about a year. And then sales plummeted when people figured out how unhealthy it was. People were being hospitalized for lung damage and lung disease. And when people started dying, the government implemented laws banning vape pens in public places, like high school, for example, because a lot of kids like to do it because of the effects it has, but it's really unhealthy for you. So because of the fact that people realized vape pens were unhealthy and the fact that the government banned them in certain areas, the maturity phase was cut short for them. Now, since we've been talking about games so much, I figured I'd bring them into this. Games usually have between a couple months to a year of maturity, depending on the game, depending on how popular it is, how mainstream it is. A game like Smash Bros, for example, usually has a very long maturity stage because it's so popular between, young kids, adolescents like you guys, even adults like to play this game. But this kind of game appeals to a very broad audience. And so usually if a game appeals to a broad audience, it has a longer maturity stage. Now, some products enjoy decades of maturity, and a great example of that is soda. Coca-Cola, the beverage, has enjoyed a maturity stage for decades. Now, they were almost put down when, the whole sugar scare came. People are less scared of sugar now than they were. Coke has never recovered its glory days, Coke is not as popular as it used to be. But they managed to reignite their maturity stage. And a maturity stage is something that you can return to depending on what actions you choose to take. And we'll talk about that in the decision point. So this is an actual PLC generated by data. I don't know what product it's for, but it really goes to show how profits go hand in hand with the product life cycle. So, a few things you need to know. Red is sales, green is profit, and the y-axis is dollars. So, as you guys know, we talked about it in business a while ago, but profit is your money that's left over after paying expenses. So when you sell a product, you charge a certain amount of money. You then use a piece of that money to pay for all the costs involved in making and selling the product. And then whatever's left over goes in your pocket, and that's called profit. Now, what happens is during the development stage where you actually come up with the product and you start, figuring out how to make it, and you start actually making it, and you start designing promotions for it, that all costs money. So during the development stage, you're actively losing money. And so that's why the green is below the line, because at this point, we're losing money. Now, in the introduction phase, we lose even more money because we have to make a whole bunch of the product, which costs money. And we have to ship the product to different parts of, the country or the province or whatever. We have to ship these products all over the place, and that costs money. We also start running promotions and commercials and stuff, and that all costs money. So we're losing money, we're losing more money, and then in the introduction phase, we're losing even more money. But then the key thing to notice here, forget these lines, by the way, don't worry about these lines. The key thing to note is that when we start making sales, our profits start to increase. Now, we're still in the negative zone here, but our profits are increasing as we make sales. And the more sales we make, the more profits we make. Now, just so you know, Just so you know, the growth phase is usually where profits start being made. This PLC is very generous in the sense that they broke even, or in other words, they paid back their expenses right at the beginning of growth. That usually doesn't happen. And the key thing to take away here is that during growth, profits increase, and during maturity, profits are at their highest level. So the money that's left over after paying your expenses is highest in the maturity stage. So this is where all the money's being made. This is where all the money goes into the pockets of the company owners and sometimes the employees, but this is where you cash out. This is where you want to be. So during the maturity stage is where you want to be, so you make as much profit as possible. And then when sales start declining, that's when profits start going down. Now, speaking of the decline stage typically begins right when sales flatten out. The maturity stage ends when sales start to decline, or they start to fall. So you'll notice that this point right here is the highest sales volume that the product will ever make. And so when sales dip below that line consistently, the decline stage starts. Now, in a real PLC, you'd probably have some ridges here, where maybe there's a snowstorm, and so sales go down a bit, and then they'd come back up. Just because sales go down for a second doesn't mean that the maturity stages ends. Like, that's it, you're done, you're not cashing out anymore. No. It's where sales consistently start to go down that we enter the decline stage. And that's where sales start to fall. And this is the bad place. This is the good place. This is the bad place. So a decline doesn't necessarily spell doom and gloom for the company, but it means the company has to act and has to do something. So One of two things or both is happening at this stage. The product is either failing to attract new customers, so we're not getting new people to buy the product because our sales are falling, right? So if we were getting new customers, our sales wouldn't fall. But our sales are falling, so we're not getting new customers. Something else that can happen is sales from our current customers decreases. So we might have people still buying from us, but they're not buying as much as they were. So maybe they don't like the product as much. Maybe they don't need the product anymore. Maybe they found something better. Who knows? But the point is that the sales numbers are falling. Now, this can be temporary. Businesses can assess the situation and try to do things to keep their maturity cycle alive. If it's not temporary, that's bad news. It means that your product has started to die. Now, in terms of being temporary, when businesses realize that they're in decline, they can do things like trying to rebrand themselves. They can do things like offering special deals. They can do all kinds of things to try and go back to the maturity stage. And we'll talk about that in what's called the decision point. But this is a classic example. If decline isn't reversed, then the product dies. Great example of that is music. When I was your age, if you wanted to listen to music, you had to use a CD. And if you wanted to listen to music portably, you had to use what was called a Discman, or a portable CD player. Now, these were big, bulky devices that were an inconvenience. It's one of the reasons why cargo pants were so popular when I was your age, is because the big leg pocket on the side was big enough to hold a Discman in it. But what happened was Apple sort of shattered the music industry and the entertainment industry by coming out with iTunes, because never before, A, had people been able to own music digitally, and B, never before were people able to buy individual tracks. If you wanted, back in the day, if you wanted music, if you wanted a song, you had to buy the whole CD. And CDs were expensive. They were like $17, $18, which was more then than it is now. And so, I mean, that was annoying. You know, who wants to spend $20 on one song? You know, then iTunes came out and you could buy one song for like $2, which was friggin' awesome. And so this changed the music industry forever. And it put the product of CDs in major decline because people didn't want to buy CDs anymore. So CDs tried to counteract this by releasing special content. So if at any point you bought a CD from a concert, usually they would put all kinds of hidden tracks or special tracks from the concert on the CD, where the band members just talked, or they joked around with the audience, or they played, you know, like songs that weren't official songs, but they were just trying songs out. But yeah, that was a way that companies tried to make decline stage temporary. And right now, iTunes is actually going through a big decline because of Spotify. Spotify lets you listen to all the music you want for a uniform price, and all the music is stored in the cloud. So you don't need, you know, a 250 gig iPod anymore. You just need a wireless connection. So Spotify has put iTunes into a decline stage. And that's how business works, and that's how new products evolve and stuff like that. Yeah, so again, just to reinforce, decline happens because either a company is not able to find new customers, or the product just isn't as effective as it used to be, or their current users aren't buying as much as they were. All right, and now we're going to talk about the decision phase, which is phase 5. The reason why it's called a decision point is because at this stage, companies have to either decide whether they want to really radicalize the product and try and find a way to metaphorically jumpstart the heart and, get this product alive again and back in the maturity stage, or they can decide to let it die. And so that's the big decision. It's a metaphorical life or death decision. And so usually companies will either release, remastered versions of the product, or they'll release a product with new enhancements and stuff like that. Maybe they'll offer deals or sales or some kind of new value. Or they'll just choose, all right, let's just sell whatever's left on the shelf, and that's it. So sometimes companies can just choose to keep things as they are, but they put them on the back burner. Great example of this is whiteout. So a great example of maintaining a product. These are all examples of products that were maintained until profits were no longer possible. So at the point where they weren't making any more money than it cost them to make the products, that's usually when companies cut products off and decide to kill them or to let them die. So examples: VHS tapes, hard drives, cassette tapes, which, man, that takes me back. Now, you guys have probably seen Guardians of the Galaxy, and that's where you were reminded about cassette tapes. But those were a major thing when I was a kid. But a great example of a product that is still being kept alive, although it's not being promoted anymore, is whiteout. Whiteout, those rolls where you press down and you roll the thing and this little tape of white is left on the page. Companies like Grandin Toy and Staples still have those. They don't promote them anymore because it's so popular to do things digitally now. But there's still a need for whiteout. And you could make the argument that whiteout is a niche product because for as long as it's not mainstream and for as long as people write with pens, there will be a need for whiteout. So essentially the companies that make whiteout are in maintenance mode. They'll keep making the product. If there's a big problem that comes along, they'll probably try to solve it, but they're not gonna improve it any longer. They're not gonna do anything radical with it. Whiteout is whiteout, and that's it. There's no way to get it any better. It is what it is. All right, so that is the general PLC. Now, that is hypothetical. Usually PLCs aren't as clean as that one, but that's the general theory. Now, there are 4 different PLC alternatives that exists outside of the general PLC. And there is a niche PLC, a fad PLC, a trend PLC, and a seasonal PLC. And depending on the product, it will fall into one of these categories. All right, so niche markets. You guys know what niche markets are. But in terms of a PLC perspective, they have a very short growth stage that leads to solid but not financially spectacular maturity stage. So remember we talked about niche markets. There's a constant demand for them, but it's nothing spectacular. It's just nice and steady. So one of the reasons why niche markets are so desirable is because they're constantly in the good place. They're constantly in the cashing out phase. So so an example of a niche market, although this is changing, are electric cars, specifically Tesla. They are expensive electric modern vehicles. They are not cheap, so which is one of the reasons why they're niche, is because they're the only electric car that is fashionable, that is powerful, that is fast, that has lots of space. They're a fantastic vehicle, and they're becoming more and more popular. So a niche product forever. But for now they are, just because there are so few competitors or I should say, there are so few direct competitors. There are very few electric vehicles that can compete with a Tesla. So that's what a niche product PLC looks like. There's development and introduction, just as there would normally be. Growth is very nonchalant. The reason why this is growth and not here is because there's a teeny bit of acceleration here. It's rather complicated. I won't get into it, but anyway, suffice to say, growth is usually very anticlimactic, and it's usually very short. The only reason it's made this big is so we can get the word in there. Maturity is usually almost like indefinite, but there will be a decline stage eventually. But this portion lasts much, much, much longer than it looks on this picture. Oh God, the rectangle. Get rid of it! So important note, niche products by definition have an endless maturity stage, even though it doesn't look like it on here. Once they are established, they continue in an endless maturity stage for as long as they can. I mean, everything comes to an end, right? Eventually, all niche markets will die, but that end is nowhere near in sight for a lot of niche products. Like whiteout, for example. Eventually, there will be no more paper used to communicate. Eventually, it'll happen, but it's not going to happen within your lifetime or my lifetime. But it will happen eventually. Next is fads. People like fads. They're explosive, they're fun, they're unpredictable. And you see them often enough. They claim their fair share of the spotlight. So a fad is a product or service that is extremely popular for a very brief period of time, and then it becomes unpopular just as fast as it came popular. They're kind of like explosions. You know, it's like, oh my God, what the hell just happened? And then people forget about them. Like fidget spinners, for example. Or Furbies. You guys remember Furbies? Or Pogs. Anyone know Pogs? Maybe? I don't know. I don't know my demographic anymore. Lots of fads. I'm trying. Tamagotchi is another one. But anyway, they're fun. If you're bored and you're looking for something to do, research fads. There are some pretty ridiculous ones. But anyway, on to a fad PLC. So this is a nice fad PLC. Usually it looks more explosive than this and sharper than this. By sharper, I mean the growth is even steeper and the decline is steeper. But this is a very nice, laid-back fad PLC. So fads usually have an explosive growth stage. So just bam, off like a rocket. And then the maturity stage is usually very, very short. And that's because, you know, one day they're super popular and then the next day they're lame. You know, and sometimes it actually goes that way. Some days it's super popular and then lame. And so maturity stage is very, very short. Sometimes it's even a couple days. And then they go into decline very fast. Oh, and also with fads, usually the decision point is just kill them. Fads are hard to resurrect just by their nature of being temporary. So usually the decision point is just let them die. Because fads are usually cheap. You know, they're usually not something that's worth keeping around for the long haul. Okay, trends. So trends are kind of like fads, except they come back, and they're not as explosive. So great example is disco clothing. They were super popular in the 70s. We got the flared out pants. We got these special shoes that were worn by men. You know, I mean, it's a pretty feminine looking shoe. Nothing wrong with that. But these were mainstream back in the day. Nowadays, I imagine these would only be worn by people with a very distinct fashion sense. But back in the 70s, these were everywhere. And so disco clothing is coming back, or it came back. I don't really keep up to date with fashion all that much, but a lot of 70s clothing is still very popular. It's come back in popularity, like leggings and flats and those really big hats, with the really, really wide brims, the circular sunglasses. You know what I'm talking about? Usually girls wear them. They're like perfectly circular sunglasses. They're usually expensive. Horn-rimmed glasses, which are very sort of trapezoidal and sharp. They have sharp edges. That's why they're called horn-rimmed. Those were really popular, and then they stopped being popular for like 20 years, and then they've come back. Another great example of trends is Pokemon. Pokemon was extraordinarily popular when I was your age, and then it kind of dropped off the radar for a while, and then Pokemon Go came back, and oh my god, Pokemon's super popular again, and now it's dying off again. People still play Pokemon Go on their phones, but not nearly as much as they did. And so now we're kind of in the decline stage of a trend PLC. Now, I'm skipping forward to a minute, just because a trend PLC looks very much like a seasonal PLC. So bear with me, I'm going to come back to this. But this is what a trend PLC looks like. The only difference is that seasonal PLCs usually correspond to some form of weather phenomenon. Not all the time, but usually there's some coordination. Trends, there isn't. Like there could be, we could do like this, and then nothing, and then, okay, popular again. So trends are not usually as regular as seasonal PLCs are. Anyway, let's go to seasonal products. Okay, so seasonal products are ones that are either not available or not desirable during certain parts of the year. But their sales and their times of popularity are quite cyclical in the sense that they have a cycle. So great example is Halloween costumes. Almost no one buys them during the year until Halloween comes along. And then Halloween stuff is super popular. You ever see those people that are standing in costumes on the side of the road with those signs and those, those stores with the big Halloween sign on them? And usually that sign is nowhere to be found until September. You know what I'm talking about? That's a great example of seasonal products. Another example is sunscreen. Now, the difference with sunscreen is it is available year-round, but it's usually not as widely available as it is during the summer. And so just because it's not in season doesn't mean it can't be bought. But sometimes it is and sometimes it's not, depending on the product type. So an example of a seasonal product that is available year-round, but that is only bought during a certain time for most of the time, is sunscreen. You can buy it year-round, but usually people buy it in the summer. An example of a product that is not available during certain times of the year is eggnog. I love eggnog. I can't have too much because it's got a lot of calories in it, but eggnog is delicious. But you can't buy it unless it's eggnog season, So during, I think it's definitely Christmas, but for some reason I feel like it's Thanksgiving too sometimes. But eggnog is a very seasonal product, and in that it is not available unless it's a certain time of the year. Same thing with Christmas decorations. So there are lots of seasonal products, but they're not all triggered by the year. Like, for example, back to school is has seasonal sales and products that comes with it. Easter has seasonal products that come with it. There's lots of mini seasonal products that aren't as explosive as things like Christmas trees and eggnog and stuff like that. But anyway, so here's what a seasonal PLC looks like. We've got intro, growth, maturity, decline, and the decision point is usually just let it die because it's out of season, right? So, but that doesn't mean they don't come back. So what happens is they decide how they're going to change things or how they're going to sell these products next season. And then this is the sort of introduction development stage. And then bam, it's introduced, and explosive growth, small maturity, decline, decision point, or death, I guess you could say. And then it's development, introduction, growth, maturity, decline, decision point, let it die again, development, introduction. So these lines represent an introductory phase. So that's what these represent. So at the start of every December, for this example, the product is introduced, and bam, we're off to the races. Now, a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that weather is the only determining factor. It's not. There are seasons outside of weather, like school season, sports seasons. There are many different kinds of seasons. The thing to remember is that the sales of seasonal products correspond with some kind of seasonal cycle, whether it's weather, sports, school, whatever. So that's it for PLCs. So head over to the Google form that I put for lesson 2. It's got, I think there's 4 questions in there, but they're pretty brief. But yeah, that's it for PLCs. We're going to talk about packaging next. So I'll see you in lesson 3.